on. Is this yours? Peter, is this yours? Is that yours? It's in English. This is set to go off at 8:45. I'm handing it over to Peter soon, but he doesn't want to be holding it when it goes off. I'm going to read. Peter unfortunately left his notes of his lecture here, so I thought I would just read it. Peter. For me, and for a number of people, it's one of those extraordinary designer architects who tried his best to subvert his involvement with architecture and then finally succumbed, luckily for Peter, but luckily for the rest of us. He is one of those people who is a kind of architect, I must say. And again, light, that's better. And spent a good part of his sort of early years, as I said, subverting, getting involved in architecture. He did the right things, worked in cabinet shops and went to architecture school, did a weird thing, and I don't know whether it was architecture that brought you there, but he came to New York and studied architecture at Pratt. I think you went back to Switzerland, got your degree, and then proceeded. And it was the time that it's a little hard for everyone in this room to understand, but it was a time when the established, whatever it was, didn't seem like the right thing to be doing. And so Peter, I'm making this up here, but I hope it's true in some way. He went off to the mountains. Actually, he was there already, Switzerland, and spent 10 years helping to basically curate some rather humble buildings. And I think in doing that, maybe you'll speak about this, but you'll see it in the work. And in doing that, I think he felt or found more being more akin to those buildings than to the buildings that were being touted in the history books and in the magazines. And certainly during those years, there was a kind of groundswell of interest in Swiss architecture, which was worthwhile, but it immediately got snagged up with the sort of architectural media and got kind of perverted in some ways. Anyways, Peter, and I don't know how this happened, but he found himself, he came down from the mountain after 10 years and suddenly found himself, and I think found himself is probably the right way to put it, practicing architecture. And in a very, very beautiful way, a number of fabulous commissions came his way, mostly through winning competitions. I must say, there was this intervening event that occurred, although Peter had built a few substantial buildings, one of which was an enclosure, a building surrounding what appeared to me to be a pile of rocks. But in Switzerland, they claimed it was an important Roman ruin. A SCI-Arc student, graduate, had visited Peter and somehow put Peter and Marion and I together in some strange way. And Peter came down to see the real Roman ruins at Hadrian's Villa. His career's never been the same since. No, that wasn't the real part. And then we were I guess the charge was to teach a class together. And Peter did the most perverse thing, because I was being kind of polite about it. And I said, Peter, what kind of program would you be interested in? And he said, what about an opera house? And I mean, I'd never been to an opera, and I have to say, after giving that project another 2 times, I don't really like opera that well. And I turned to Peter and said, but Peter, do you like opera? He said, no, I don't even know anything about it. But that might be a good thing to do something we both don't know anything about. We did that. We ended up with, I think, our students, some of which are here, turning out some of the strangest opera houses. They really were opera houses mostly for operas that hadn't been written yet, and probably won't be. Peter once said, and maybe he'll say tonight, that he likes to do architecture that you really walk right by and you don't notice it. I must say that's been the case for me. I've never noticed any of your buildings, Peter. What he means by that, and he didn't ever, well, he did say that he has more to say about that. You don't notice it, meaning it doesn't hit you in the face. It doesn't come out at you, although, as you'll see tonight, it's not altogether true. But that the buildings become part of you, and in fact become an extremely strong part of you. So not at first noticing them, at some point you find that the building is kind of overwhelming you. Not, well, that's the wrong way to say it. The building becomes part of you in a very, very powerful way. It's been such a pleasure to know Peter at a distance. We speak to each other once every 5 years, but to watch his building career sort of flourish and to watch the extraordinary buildings come to fruition. Peter, I'm looking forward to tonight's lecture by you.
This? On your glasses. Hold on. Oh, yeah. It's fixed.
Oh, okay.
What do you do with that?
And what do I do with this? Just put it somewhere?
It goes off, watch out.
Can you hear me? No, it works. Oh, please. How do I do this? Huh? Pocket. It's technical stuff. See, they come from the mountain and to deal with this technical stuff here. Okay, it's nice to be back after 8 years, 9 years. Robert's mistake, he doesn't know how to mount the microphone. Okay. That doesn't work. It does not work. Please, huh? This is not nice, you know. So,
up here?
Up here, okay. Try. Watch it. Is it okay now? Wow, listen. Okay. See, I do nothing. I do nothing. Huh? Crazy stuff. Okay. I'm sort of interested in doing buildings, and I always have been interested in making things. I'm not interested in drawings. I'm not interested in models. I'm not so much interested in architectural magazines and all this kind of world. I think I've nothing against it. It's just not sort of my cup of tea. But I have this sort of like passion to try to make buildings. I think it's a really great thing as an architect to be able to really work with material and try to make something like spaces or something. The older I get, the more mysterious it becomes a little bit to me to what is a good space And when does a building acquire a soul or something like that? I don't know, if you allow me this old-fashioned kind of, hey, can you do this? It's terrible. Okay, so this is sort of background, and then you have to know we have this practice in Switzerland, in the mountain region, even though I'm from Basel, from the city of Basel, unfortunately, Robert, but this legend of this mountain guy, you can keep it. Up there, and I want to keep this office always between like 8 and 12 to 14 people, so that we can always work sort of more, I guess, like a family, and that I know all the screws and nails and bolts of all of my buildings, and the stuff doesn't get out of control. I'm going to, sometimes I like to look at the world, right? I like to look at the world, at buildings and the relationship of buildings to landscapes and cities and this whole thing. And then I'm sort of like a stroller, sort of. I don't concentrate too much, I think. But then I see things, and all of a sudden later when I work, I find out they have something to do with what I'm doing here. You know, the stuff comes up. You must know this is nothing special. So what I'm doing here, I'm going to read a text to you, which has, it's actually really easy. It's observations, which for some reason were important to me. Maybe you can share some of the interests. Maybe somebody can solve this technical problem. And I know it's not easy to listen if somebody reads, especially if I read it, you know. So it's not so long, right? I think it takes sort of like 32 minutes, you know, and then it'll be over. That's one thing which relieves you a little, and the other thing is there will be images. And there will be all images by my favorite photographer, Hélène Binet. Maybe some of you know her work. And Helen, so I show these images, and there are some of our buildings, some older ones, some newer ones, and they have nothing directly to do with the text. It's just for you to sort of take a rest if you don't want to listen, right? Okay. I was interviewed by the curator of the museum. He tried to sound me out by means of clever, unexpected questions. What did I think about architecture? What was important to me about my work? These were the things he wanted to know. The tape recorder was on. I did my best. At the end of the interview, I realized that I was not really satisfied with my answers. Later that evening, I talked to a friend about Aki Kaurismäki's latest film. I admire the director's empathy and respect for his characters. He does not subject his actors to his will, like a conductor to whom they are merely the means of expressing a concept, but shows them in a light which lets us sense their dignity and their personality. Kaurismäki's art lends his films a feeling of warmth, I think, and I told this to my colleague. And then I knew what it was I would have liked to have said on the tape this morning. To build houses like Kaurismäki makes films. That's what I would like to do. The hotel in which I was staying was designed by a French star designer whose work I do not know because I'm not interested in trendy design. But from the moment I entered the hotel, the atmosphere created by his architecture began taking its effect. Artificial light illuminated the hall like a stage. Abundant muted light, bright accents on the reception desks, made of different kinds of natural stone in niches in the wall. People ascending the graceful stairway to encircling galleries stood out against a shining golden wall. Above, One could sit in one of the dress circle boxes overlooking the hall and have a drink or a snack. There are only good seats here. Christopher Alexander, who speaks in pattern language of spatial situations in which people instinctively feel good, would have been pleased. I sat in a box overlooking the hall, a spectator, feeling that I was part of the designer's stage set. I liked looking down on the activity below, where the people came and went, entered and exited. I felt I understood why the designer is so successful. She had seen a small house by Frank Lloyd Wright that made a great impression on her, said my friend. Its rooms were so small and intimate, their ceilings so low. There was a tiny library with special lighting and a lot of decorative architectural elements, and the whole house made a strong horizontal impression, which she never had experienced before. And the old lady was still living there. There was no need for me to go and see the house, I thought. I knew just what she meant. I knew the feeling of home that she described. Isn't this terrible? See, it's like a wave kind of thing. The members of the jury were shown buildings by architects competing for a prize for good architecture. I studied the documents describing a small red house in a rural setting, a barn converted into a dwelling which had been enlarged by the architect and inhabitants. The extension was a success, I thought. You could see what had been done to the house beneath the saddle roof, but it was well modeled, integrated. The window openings were sensitively placed. The old and the new were balanced and harmonious. The new parts of the house did not seem to be saying, I'm new, but I am a part of the new whole. Nothing spectacular or innovative, nothing striking, based perhaps on a somewhat outdated design principle, old-fashioned approach, keyed to craftsmanship. We agreed that we could not award this conversion a prize for design, for that its architectural appearance was too modest. Yet I do enjoy thinking back on the small red house. In a book about timber construction, my attention was caught by photographs of huge areas of closely packed tree trunks floating on wide expanses of water. I also liked the picture on the cover of the book, a collage of lengths of wood arranged in layers like a cross-section. The numerous photos of wooden buildings, despite the fact that they were architecturally commendable, were less appealing to me. It's some years now since I built wooden houses. The young colleague asked me how I would go about building a house of wood after working for some years with stone and concrete and steel and glass. At once, I had a mental image of a house-sized block of solid timber, a dense volume made of the biological substance of wood, horizontally layered and precisely hollowed out. A house like this would change its shape, would swell and contract, expand and decrease in height, a phenomenon which would have to be an integral part of the design. My young colleague told me that in Spanish, his mother tongue, the words wood, mother, and material were similar, madeira, madre, materia. We started talking about the sensuous qualities and cultural significance of the elemental materials of wood and stone, and about how we could express this in our buildings. The former town villa looked somewhat lost in the park-like expanse. It was the only building in that part of the town to have survived the destruction of Second World War. Previously used as an embassy, it was now being enlarged by a third of its original size according to the plans of a competent architect. Hard and self-assured, the extension stood side by side with the old building. On the one hand, a hewn stone base, stucco facades and balustrades. On the other, a compressed modern annex made of exposed concrete, a restrained, disciplined volume which alluded to the old main building while maintaining a distinct dialogic distance in terms of its design. I found myself thinking about the old castle in my village. It has been altered and extended many times over the centuries, developing gradually from a cluster of freestanding buildings into a closed complex with an inner courtyard. A new architectural whole emerged at each stage of its development. Historical incongruities were not the architectural theme of the design. The old was adapted to the new, or the new to the old, in the interest of the complete, integrated appearance of its latest stage of evolution. It is only when one analyzes the substance of the walls, strips them of their plaster, and examines their joints, that these old buildings reveal their complex genesis. I entered the exhibition pavilion. Once again, I was confronted by sloping walls, slanted planes, surfaces linked loosely and playfully together, buttons and ropes hanging, leaning, floating or pulling, taut or projecting. The composition disclaimed the right angle and sought an informal balance. Architecture which made a dynamic impression, symbolizing or being a movement. Its gestures filled the available space, desiring to be looked at, to make their mark. There was not much room left for me. I followed the winding path indicated by the architecture. In the next pavilion, I was encountered by the wide, spacious elegance of the sweeping lines and forms of the Brazilian master. Once again, my interest was captured by the large rooms and the emptiness of the huge outdoor spaces in the photos. Annalisa told me that on the beach of a small seaside resort in Cinque Terre, the Cinque Terre region, Italy, a holiday destination visited mainly by Italians. A large number of the women are tattooed. Maybe they underline their individuality of their bodies, use them to proclaim their identity, I don't know. The body as a refuge in a world which would appear to be flooded by artificial signs of life, and in which philosophers ponder on virtual reality. The human body as an object of contemporary art. Surveys, disclosures which seek knowledge, or the human body as a fetish of self-assertion which can only succeed when looked at in the mirror or seen through the eyes of others? I don't know. This autumn, I visited an exhibition of contemporary architectural projects from France. I saw shining objects made of glass, gentle shapes without edges, taut, elegant curves which rounded off the geometrical volumes of the objects at specific points, and whose lines reminded me of Rodin's drawings of nudes, endowed the object with the quality of sculptures. Architectural models, beautiful bodies, celebrations of surface textures, skin, hermetic and flawless, embracing the bodies. A glass partition divided up the length of the narrow corridor of the old hotel. The wing of a door below, a firmly fixed pane of glass above, no frame. The panes clamped and held at the corners by two metal clasps. Normally done, nothing special. Certainly not a design by an architect, but I liked the door. Was it because of the proportions of the two panes of glass, the form and position of the clamps, the gleaming of the glass and the muted colors of the dark corridor? Or was it because the upper pane of glass, which was taller than the average height swing door below it, emphasized the height of the corridor? I did not know. I was shown some photographs of a complicated building. Different areas, planes and volumes seemed to overlap each other, slanting and erect, encapsulated one within the other. The building, whose unusual appearance gave me no clear indication as to its function, made a strangely overloaded and tortured impression on me. Somehow, it seemed two-dimensional, and for a moment I thought I was looking at a photograph of a cardboard model, colorfully painted. Later, when I learned the name of the architect, I was shocked. Had I made a mistake, a premature, ignorant judgment? The architect's name has an international ring. His fine architectural drawings are well known, and his written statements about contemporary architecture, which also deal with philosophical themes, are widely published. A town villa in Manhattan with a good address, just completed. The new facade in line of the street of buildings stood out distinctly. In the photographs, a natural stone shield surrounded by glass looked like a backdrop. It looked like a backdrop. In reality, the facade was more uniform, more integrated in its surroundings than in the photo. My instinct to criticize vanished when I entered the house. The quality of its construction captured my attention. The architect received us, took us into the vestibule, and showed us from room to room. The rooms were spacious, their order logical. We were eager to see each succeeding room and were not disappointed. The quality of the daylight entering through the glazed rear facade and the skylight over the stairs was pleasant. On all the floors, the presence of the intimate backyard around which the main rooms were grouped was perceptible, even at the heart of the building. and the architect spoke in respectful, amicable terms of the clients, the newly installed residents, of their understanding of his work, of his effort to comply with their requirements, and of their criticism of some impractical aspects which he had subsequently improved. He opened cupboard doors, lowered large screens which suffused the living room with a mellow light, showed us folding partitions, and demonstrated huge swing doors which moved noiselessly between two pivots, closing tightly and precisely. Every now and then, he touched the surface of some material or ran his hand over a handrail, a joint in the wood, the edge of a glass pane. The town I was visiting had a particularly attractive neighborhood. Buildings from the 19th century and the turn of the century, solid volumes placed along the streets and squares, constructed of stone or brick. Nothing exceptional maybe, but typically urban. The public premises on the lower floors faced the road. Dwellings above retreated behind protective facades, hiding private spheres behind prestigious faces, anonymous faces, clearly divorced from the public space, which began with a hard edge at the foot of the facade. I had been told that the number of architects, the leading architects of the town, of the country, lived and worked in this neighborhood. I remembered this a few days later when I was looking at an extension to the town by well-known architects, and I found myself thinking about the rigorous backs and fronts of the urban structures, precisely articulated public spaces, graciously restrained facades, and exactly fitting volumes for the body of the town. For years, we had been working on the concept, the form, and the working drawings of our stone-built thermal baths. Then construction began. I was standing in front of one of the first blocks which the masons had built in stone from the nearby quarry. I was surprised and irritated. Although everything corresponded exactly with our plans, I had not expected this concurrent hardness and softness, this smooth yet rugged quality, this iridescent gray-green presence emanating from the square stone blocks. For a moment, I had the feeling that our project had escaped us and become independent because it had now evolved into a material entity which obeyed its own laws. I visited an exhibition of work by Merit Oppenheim at the Guggenheim Museum. The techniques he uses are strikingly varied. There is no continuous, consistent style. Nevertheless, I experienced her way of thinking, her way of looking at the world, and of intervening in it through her work as coherent and integral. So there is probably no point in wondering just what it is that links the famous fur cup she made and the snake made up of pieces of coal. I wish I could quote Merit Oppenheim's well-known sentence precisely now. Was it something like, "To be effective, every idea must have a form"? When I try to identify the aesthetic intentions which I use to design buildings, I realize that my thoughts revolve around themes such as place, material, energy, presence, memory, reminiscence, image, mood, atmosphere, density, or concentration. During the course of my work, I try to give these abstract terms concrete contents relevant to the actual assignment, keeping in mind that what I'm designing will be part of a place, part of a surrounding, that it will be used and loved, discovered, inherited, given away, abandoned, and perhaps even hated. In short, that it will be lived in the widest sense of the word. Martin Heidegger gave the title Bauen, Wohnen und Denken, Building, Dwelling, Thinking, to an essay, with his reflections on what it means when man builds a home and lives in a specific place. Building, dwelling, and thinking are activities which man uses as ways to learn about, accept, and belong to the world. Heidegger observed that our thinking, as abstract as it may seem, is closely and essentially connected with our experience of place. This has something to do with the fact that man exists in places, that he forms his relationship with the world on the basis of his standpoint in places, or simply that he lives in the world. Thus, the thought process is not abstract, but works with spatial images. It has sensuous components. It uses the images of places and spaces to which we have access, which we remember. In other words, thought travels through a specific mental space which contains traces of place and architecture. When I design a work of architecture, I try to use the spatial associative energy of thought. I regard the store of personal and collective experience of dwelling, of having been in places and spaces that we have stored in our bodies as the fertile ground and starting point of my work. It is from this wealth of experience that the first images emerge, the images from which form the form of the object in search is developed. For me, this work is a process which begins and ends with dwelling. In my mind, I rehearse dwelling in the house. I imagine that what it will feel like to live in the building I'm designing, recalling at the same time all the experiences of places and space we are capable of making, those that we have made and those that we have yet to make, and those I dream about that we should make in the house as yet unbuilt. So the quest for the new object that I shall design and build consists largely of reflections upon the way we really experience the many places of our so different dwellings throughout the world. In a forest, for example, on a bridge, on a town square, in a house, in a room, in my room, in your room, in summer, in the morning, at twilight, in the rain. I hear the sounds of the cars moving outside, the voices of birds and the steps of the passers-by. I see the rusty metal of the door, the blue of the hills in the background, the shimmer of the air over the asphalt. I feel the warmth reflected by the wall behind me. The curtains in the slender window recesses move gently in the breeze. The air smells damp from yesterday's rain, preserved by the soil in the plant trough. Everything I see the cement slabs that hold the earth, the wire of the trellis, the turned baluster of the railings on the terrace, the plastered arch over the passageway, they all show traces of wear, of use, and of dwelling. And when I look more carefully, the things I see start to tell me something about why, how, and for what purpose they were made. All this comes to light or is concealed within their form and presence. I'm impressed by the self-evident presence of an ensemble that rings true, a milieu well fitted to its purpose, that the harmony between the work of nature and the work of man, the interplay between density, lightness, and void, between sounds and smells, light and shade, materials and forms, occur by accident, or was it carefully composed? The casual passerby, inhabitant or stroller, who could be me, is not concerned with such questions. He is concerned with houses and spaces which fit, which are tuned well with their surroundings and are appropriate to their use. He is concerned with places and houses which are conducive to his well-being, which enable him to live comfortably and peacefully while giving him almost imperceptible support, in which he looks good and which charm him with unexpected offers. I personally like the idea that the house I build would contribute to the atmospheric density of a place, which some people later would remember with pleasure. So please look at something like some more images. So thank you for your patience. Huh?
Peter, would you like to answer some questions?
If necessary.
If necessary.
I could do it.
On a Friday night, it might not
I
be
answer
necessary.
questions, but maybe it's not necessary, and we go all out for a drink. Huh?
Thank you again, Peter.
Okay.